He held high-level positions in military strategy and defense policy on the National Security Council staff. He retired from the Navy after a distinguished 31-year career as a Rear Admiral, and he currently is at DCS Advisory, a leading investment banking firm, as Managing Director, focusing on security risk as part of their software advisory team. Please welcome Alex.
I have to admit that the thought of being worried about speaking to a group of engineers never really crossed my mind until I came down here and have listened to the last 2 days and the amount of information that you've covered that I kind of wanted to talk about. And rather than to repeat what others have said, I just want to concentrate on one thing, and that is the human dimension, and a very specific part of the human dimension, the part that where that person in your firm who everyone despises because he or she raises his hand and asks that question that no one once asked. And the reason why I want to cover that is because that's kind of what I did for a long time in the military. Before I get, we tell stories in the SEAL teams only. We don't call them stories, we call it leadership by nostalgia. And I will start with a little leadership by nostalgia, but first I want to point out that I've been wondering what OT stood for the last 2 days till I learned this morning. But OT for 31 years to me didn't stand for operations technology or whatever. It stood for target. And at the very beginning of my career, which was the very end of the Cold War, we were taught how to systematically take down systems and how you approached there was a method to planning how to target a system. And I would tell you that, and kind of in line with some of the other stuff I'm going to say, that a big part of that was people. And the weakest link in almost any system that we were attacking was almost always the people. And I think you can see that, how the Iranian engineers were targeted and other things like that. But without further ado, a little leadership by nostalgia. So the best team I was ever on didn't start as the best team I was ever on. It was actually one of the biggest nightmares of my career. I was reporting to a very high-level elite staff, and you had to take a bunch of psychological tests to get on this staff. And you had to be interviewed by the psychologist and go through some other interviews. And at the end of the process, the psychologist looks at me and he says, "You just don't belong here, but they want you, so I guess I have to say yes." And 2 weeks later, I found out why. We went on an exercise overseas, and the upshot of the exercise is that everyone I was working with, well, first of all, they left me overseas for an additional 4 days, and they all went home early. And they all stormed into our mutual boss's office and they said, "Hey, we want this guy fired right now. We don't get along with him and he asks too many questions and we just need him gone right now." And the guy who was our mutual boss, his nickname was Flatliner because he never really got excited about anything. And Flatliner kind of looked up like this from his desk and he said, "That's why he's here." And it took us 6 months to figure out how to work together, and the way we figured it out was one of my co-workers, Army Special Forces, a Green Beret named Bob. Bob one day gets us all together and goes, "I figured it out, guys. We're a football team." He goes, "Jeff, you're the quarterback." And Jeff, whose nickname was Silverback, he was a big Army Ranger, and he would probably kill you if you disagreed with him. That's why he was the quarterback. Another Jeff was the star wide receiver, also an Army Ranger. Another SEAL, Bill and Bob, the Special Forces guy, they were interior linemen. For them it was like 3 yards and a big cloud of dust, but they did all the work. We had an artilleryman who made slides for us, and he had some role. But then the last but not least was me. And Bob looks at me and goes, "Alex, you're special teams." And I didn't understand what he meant. But the next time we had a really hard planning process, we used to all come in this room and plan, and there were lots of whiteboards and everything. And we were all in there, and we're about to start planning, and Bob looks at me and goes, "Get out." And they kicked me out of the room. And I would literally go sit in another room and, I don't know, read books or do whatever I did. And then every so often they would come out and they'd go, hey, come in. And they would tell me what was going on with the plan and where they were having problems. And I would ask a couple of questions. They'd look at me funny and they'd go, okay, get out again. And the point is that that was the best team I was ever on. We were absolutely phenomenal. Some of the greatest planned operations, some of the neatest stuff I ever did in 31 years in the military, where we got to really figure out how to truly break some fun stuff. We did as in that team. But we had to all know our role, and in many ways, I was unhappy not to be sitting in the room with everyone else, but I played a very important role because I was the guy who looked at things differently from a kind of an oblique angle and was able to get them over, the rough spots. But, truth be told, I was absolutely hopeless at routine planning. I just don't have the discipline to sit there and deal with all the details. And part of that is SEAL training, and part of it is just nature. So with that, see, I can't even work a, anyway, whoops. So the military versus the private sector. I'm not going to, a lot of this we've already covered, and a lot of it's just self-evident. To me, many of you, or many of you who've spoken, have an understanding of culture that frankly eludes the greater corporate world. And I think it's because a lot of you deal with very hard problems. You have similar backgrounds in engineering, that kind of thing. Even the less obvious ones I think you can appreciate, but I do want to talk about that last one, the intellectual heritage and vernacular technology one, because I think it's important to understand, and I think it will resonate with you and you'll be able to use it in the future. So the first thing, Harvey was talking about 30 years in his industry, or safety has improved in 30 years. And just a touch point on where the military is coming from, 30 centuries we've probably been organizing to kill and hurt one another. And that is a tremendous heritage, both for good and evil. But there's a culture that goes with it, and there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of wisdom that comes with that 30 centuries of organized destruction. And we in the military, or I'm not in the military anymore, but the military is heir to it. And so are all the people fighting the military. They all can draw on those lessons too. And at one really basic level, there's what I've heard referred to as vernacular technology. And vernacular technology is an example. In South America, there's a hillside that's been farmed for like 800, 1,000 years. If someone went out there today, they would never farm it in a million years. You couldn't even figure out how to farm it. But over 1,000 years, these people figured out how to do it, and they've been doing it, and it works for them. And it's these small lessons that accrete over year after year after year. And the way that translates into the military, there are all these little things you do in the military that you have no idea why you do them. And usually when you're going through training, some big instructor tells you just shut up and color and do whatever it is they're telling you. But then when you go over to Iraq or Afghanistan, you'll learn why they taught you to do that stuff. And it's kind of like you have to push the I believe button sometimes until things go really awry, and then you figure out why you're doing things that way. So there's a lot of stuff in your industry, and before you toss stuff out wholesale, I would encourage you to look at why previous generations of engineers or plant managers did things the way they did them. So next, the military spends a lot of time thinking about the future, and I have two slides on this. One is strategic, the high level, and the other one's tactical. There are people whose job every single day in the military is just to look at our strategy for, say, North Korea or Iran or wherever. And I guarantee you there's a strategy for anything you can think of. And they look at that plan and they figure out how to make it better or worse. And there's actually a process to looking at the plans on a certain rotation. All this is driven by what I term imaginative paranoia. What's the worst thing that can happen? I think this fits in well with the previous speaker, some of the things we were talking about consequence. We imagine what is the very worst that can happen, and then we plan for that. And I think it drives people who aren't used to military thinking crazy. Wives especially can't deal with husbands they're always planning everything, and they can't seem to kind of settle down. And then applied against that imaginative paranoia is that whole history of warfare and different theories of how to go to war. Americans tend to fight war a certain way through attrition, but there's another kind of warfare, an old style of warfare that's actually like the German U-boats in World War II called guerre de course. And guerre de course is where you attack an enemy's economy and try to bring them to their knees by interrupting their supply chain. And that's how our enemies are likely to fight us, and that may be a big part of cyber warfare. And then once you plan something or analyze it, you war game it. You sit around a room and you kind of talk through it. How would we do this? If this happens, you know, how will we respond? That kind of thing. And there's a lot of value in that, and you know, I would encourage that as you're looking at your consequence management. So at the tactical level, the military is an incredibly conservative organization, and we train and test everything. Team building is almost a constant enterprise in the military, and I think, to be honest with you, having been in investment banking for, I think, 17 months now, it's the one part of investment banking that I wish we could do more of. It's almost impossible to build a team of investment bankers, at least in my experience, and it's the hardest thing for me to accept. The military doesn't change quickly, and it doesn't, but when it does change, the change is very rapid. And there's a concept in evolution called punctuated equilibrium, where something suddenly happens and everything changes, and that tends to be how the military works. And I think in the cyber world, after certain big cyber attacks, either in the past or the future, things change very rapidly, like punctuated equilibrium, which is very, you know, something very comfortable to the military. And then in the military, that team is not just about the operators, it's about the people who do logistics, it's the people who plan for the future. And also there's a premium in the military placed on execution. It's not how well you know, a plan is only worth so much, it's the execution that really matters. And I throw those two pictures on the bottom. One, the what we call log PT. You know, that's a great team building exercise, but you can't really do it after training, it's just too hard. And the dog's on there for another reason. People never plan well for the future. We being the SEAL teams, had dogs in Vietnam, and we got rid of them after Vietnam because, frankly, dogs are really hard to take care of in a military context. And it's funny because Iraq and Afghanistan roll around, and what do? All of a sudden we have dogs again. And you know, the regulations about dogs are unbelievable, how, you know, the way they have to be treated, like air-conditioned dog houses, things like that. And we had to learn all that again. And another just little venture into leadership and nostalgia, when I had the 4 West Coast SEAL teams, the commanding officers used to always get up on the conference table, not literally, but they may as well have, and yell at me, you know, we need this, we need that for the next war, blah, blah, blah. And I would look at them, I would walk out the door, and on the wall in the corridor outside the conference room was a picture of this awesome dune buggy with 50 cal machine guns and missiles and all kinds of other stuff on it. And I would bring it in and I'd say, look, this is the Desert Patrol vehicle. This is how we thought we were going to war in, you know, the next war in the desert. And oh, by the way, we haven't used it for the last 10 years because no one ever predicts the next war correctly. It's the training and how quickly you can adapt when the crisis happens that matters, not having exactly the right gear to do it. So just some thoughts from what I call my random walk through Silicon Valley. Below in the pictures you have you know, like that's like a watch cog, if like you pry the back off a mechanical watch. That's complicated. If you or I sat there for a while, we can get it, we understand it. It's gears working, and you just have to figure it out. But on the right, you see on the right, you see a picture of a crowd, and you can't see all the little flags there. But that's complexity. Who knows what's going through those people's minds? Who knows what the relationship between all those people is? People are complex. Machines tend to be complicated. I know that the AI people and machine learning have created these black boxes, and those are our complexity, and that is our future. But for right now, we're still dealing with a complicated physical world for the most part and a complex people world. And the people world is where the really bad things happen in my experience rather. KISS, Grant's Captain. KISS is, for those of you, I think we've already heard it once, but keep it simple, stupid, or in the military, keep it simple, sir. And if I could do one thing in Silicon Valley, I think it would be Grant's Captain. Grant's Captain, allegedly Grant had a captain, Napoleon had a corporal that sat outside their tent, and they wrote an order, and the captain and the corporal were kind of slow, and they would give the order to the captain or the corporal, and they would read it. And if the captain could understand it, the order was good and they sent it out. And if it wasn't, then it got rewritten. And frankly, with a lot of the pitches I see for companies in Silicon Valley, I wish Grant's Captain was around because I can't understand half of what they're saying. And to me, that suggests there might be a problem with the product. And I think that goes with contingency plan. Any plan should be read by a Grant's Captain. Integrating what you're doing in your business with the culture of your business, I think, is the key to success. And it's so hard to do. If you try to change your company, maybe your successor's successor will benefit. I mean, it just takes that long, but it doesn't mean you stop doing it. It just means you recognize it takes longer. And then mimetic-driven change. I think one of the other unfortunate realities in Silicon Valley is whatever the current meme of the day is, that's what's in your pitch. So last year when I talked to cybersecurity companies, it was all about AI. This year it tends to be about binary. In other words, things are either yes or no, and if it's, they're trying to shut everything out and isolate systems. It's a very different approach than what I saw yesterday, or last year rather. Now obviously that's an incredible generalization, but I do see that, and it does worry me because it tells me that people are more interested in making a buck than really protecting your systems. And finally, kind of where all this leads to, in my mind, and this kind of echoes what General Hayden said yesterday, the Internet of Things, which is obviously different but a great target in and of itself, and the industrial Internet of Things, they are targets for a lot of different people. There's a strategic level where nation states want to attack you. There's an espionage level where they just want to find out what you're doing, either for industrial espionage or actual, if you're a defense company, real espionage. There are tactical things. They just want to shut you down to create, uncertainty about your product's reliability. And then we talked about the activists at length yesterday, so I'm not going to cover it. And inside that activist thing, though, I think is this idea of the insider threat, which to this day I think is the biggest threat in terms of potential consequences. And you have to, there's been some discussion, I think, in the last brief about consequence, but you have to, what are they trying to do to you? Are they trying to destroy you or just defraud you? And you protect against destruction a lot different than you protect against being defrauded. And on top of that, the assets you have to put against those different problems are very, very different. And you might be willing to accept some level of being defrauded, whereas you'll never accept destruction. In the challenge of multidimensional protection, it's really about sitting around a table, asking questions about what you're willing to accept, what you're not willing to accept, and having those tough conversations and taking a realistic approach rather than trying to protect everything. And once you figure out what you're trying to do, you got to put money towards it. That's one thing great about the military is once you figure out a threat, if it's a big enough threat and it's high enough, they'll allocate money against it. And that's exactly how we go about getting money from Congress to do that. I can't say enough about building the right team, and you unfortunately have to have someone like me on it, I think. You don't want too many. I think one's enough, frankly. But I think organizations are made better by someone who's who's willing to ask hard questions. And 1 minute. Anyway, anytime my hand went up in my last job, I was a 1-star, I was working for a 4-star, you could just see the heads go down around the room. Oh my God, he's going to get the 4-star angry again. And then the last piece, heeding the heretics. I was told this, but then I watched it. Watch World War Z. There's this concept of the 10th man in there. You have 9 men agreeing. You have a 10th man whose job is to argue with the other 9. It's not such a bad idea in security contexts. I highly recommend Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, or the abbreviated Michael Lewis, I can't remember the title right now, about Kahneman and Tversky's work, because you need to understand, when working with people, you need to understand cognitive bias, and you need to understand how your own thinking is prejudiced and how your mind works. Nassim Taleb in The Black Swan, we talked about, he's another guy who can really get you thinking about things. He's very hard to get through. He's very arrogant, but he's very, very right, too. And then evolution has come up a couple of times. Evolution is an interesting thing because no one's running it. It just kind of happens. And it's all those hackers throwing stuff against your systems every single day. And they learn stuff. In Iraq, it was amazing how quickly people learned. They would attack one way, it failed. But they would film the attack, and then another guy would learn, and they would do the attack a little better next time. And the rapid learning that took place was insane. And with that, I will leave you to your imaginative paranoia.